Hi, so my name is William Hamilton. I'm an assistant professor at McGill University and also a CFAR Canada Chair in AI here at the Mila Institute in Montreal, Quebec. And today, I'm going to be discussing the emerging subfield of graph representation learning with an emphasis on summarizing some of the important recent advances as well as open challenges within this area. So I'm assuming that most, or at least many of you, are familiar with the challenge of learning over graph or network structured data. So for example, we might want to take social network data and try to predict interactions between individuals. We might want to analyze knowledge graphs, biomedical networks, molecule structures, or even try to represent the syntax of language or code as a graph structure that we can then analyze with machine learning models. And so first, just to give a summary of some of the key tasks that we want to do when we're learning with graph structured data. So one of the most canonical and popular tasks in graph representation learning is the task of node classification. So here, we're given an input graph where we have a set of nodes or vertices that are connected by some relationships or edges. And our goal is to take our input graph, where we might have some labels associated with a subset of the nodes. We want to apply a learning algorithm over this input graph to infer missing labels on the rest of the nodes. So as an example of this node classification task in the real world, we can imagine being given a graph representation of the interactome, so all the proteins in the human body and how they interact with one another. And we might want to use this graph representation to try to classify the function of various different proteins. Another very important and canonical task in graph representation learning and machine learning on graphs is called link prediction. So here, we're again given an input graph, but instead of trying to predict labels on nodes, instead our goal is to infer whether or not particular edges exist within this graph. And again, as another biological example of where this can be applied in the real world, we could imagine having a biomedical interaction network or knowledge graph, which summarizes the interactions or relationships between various biological entities such as drugs, diseases, and proteins. And inferring missing edges or performing link prediction on such a network can really be viewed as a way to do something like computational treatment design. We might want to predict whether or not a drug will interact with some disease that it hasn't been tested on. As the final canonical example of the kinds of learning problems that we want to do on graphs, we can look at graph classification. So here, instead of being given a single input graph, we instead have a set of graphs as input, and each of these individual graphs is associated with a label, and our goal is to apply some learning algorithm in order to infer the missing labels on these different graphs. So as an example of graph classification in the real world, we can look at the problem of predicting the properties of molecules based on their graph structure. So for example, trying to predict whether or not a molecule is soluble or stable or even toxic. So this idea of machine learning on graphs, and in particular deep learning on graphs, has seen a dramatic rise in popularity over the last 5 to 10 years. So what I'm showing here is just a plot summarizing the search trends from Google search for the term or phrase recurrent neural network, shown in red, and then graph neural network, which is one of the dominant methods in graph representation learning, shown here in blue. And you can see that over the last 5 years, the interest in graph neural networks, at least in terms of Google search trends, has begun to approach the number of searches for recurrent neural networks. So the goal for today is going to be to first off giving a brief history of this emerging subfield of graph representation learning. So I'm going to try to summarize some of the key advancements within the last 5 or so years that have driven this field during its rise to prominence. After that, I'm going to introduce and discuss 2 theoretical paradigms that we can use to understand and analyze techniques in graph representation learning, and graph neural networks in particular. And then lastly, building on this theoretical discussion, I'm going to introduce 3 important open problems and 1 grand challenge that I think are critical areas for us to investigate if we want to drive techniques in graph representation learning forward. And most of the content I'm going to be discussing today is going to be based on a forthcoming book. It's going to be published hopefully before the end of this year. This is the book on graph representation learning. And if you're curious about a current draft, it's available at the link I have shown down there. Okay, so beginning now with our brief history of graph representation learning and starting with a bit more formal background and motivation. So first off, what exactly is graph representation learning? Well, really, the goal of graph representation learning, like representation learning at large, is to learn useful representations. So here, what we're going to do is design algorithms that can generate useful representations, usually Euclidean vectors, of graph structure. So for example, we can look at what can be called the node-direct task of embedding nodes, as well as tasks like graph-direct, where we're trying to represent entire graphs. And you might wonder, what makes graph representation learning more challenging than standard representation learning or standard deep learning? Now, the reason for this is that modern deep learning and representation learning algorithms were really designed for some relatively simple kinds of geometric structures. So in particular, convolutional neural networks are designed to work on images or more generally fixed size grids, whereas recurrent neural networks are designed to work only with sequences or chains. And the challenge is that when we're working with more general graphs, they lack this regular geometric structure. So two key challenges that arise from this lack of geometric regularity in graphs is first off, that we have no more straightforward notions of spatial locality when we're working with graphs. So if we have one node that's a neighbor of another node, which is a neighbor of another node, we don't have a straightforward notion of, say, transitivity for general graphs. And this lack of spatial locality makes it really hard to define things like pooling operations on graphs. Another really important issue is that graphs have inherent symmetries that lead to non-unique representations. So in particular, if we want to define a graph level function, so if we want to define a function which takes a input graph, so here we can represent an input graph by an adjacency matrix and generates an embedding of this input graph, this graph level function must be invariant to any permutations of the nodes on this graph. So in particular, if we permute the adjacency matrix that we're inputting to our function, we should get the same thing as if we just input the original adjacency matrix. That's because if we work with different permutations of an adjacency matrix, they still represent the same graph. So we really need graph functions that we're defining to satisfy this invariance property. In a similar way, if we're trying to define node level functions, so functions that map the nodes in a graph to certain representations, these functions also have an inherent symmetry they need to satisfy. They need to be permutation equivariant. That is, if we're going to permute the input to a node embedding function, the output of that function should just be an equivalently permuted output. So if we're going to permute the order of all the nodes in the input, we should get the same embeddings just permuted in an analogous way. And this challenge of permutation invariance and equivariance is something very fundamental, and it's related to this challenge that graph isomorphism or isomorphism testing is really an implicit and challenging bottleneck when we're trying to do graph representation learning. So this is the fact that even just trying to determine whether or not two graphs represent the same thing or correspond to the same object is computationally difficult. It's an NP indeterminate problem. And the reason why it's difficult is, again, this issue that when we're given an adjacency matrix, a representation of a graph, we have no idea how to order the nodes in that adjacency matrix so that we can compare it to some other graph. Okay, so that's a quick summary of the motivation and background regarding why graph representation learning is a challenging and interesting problem. I'm now going to introduce a brief history on some of the most important, or at least most popular techniques that have been used in this subfield over the past, say, 5 to 10 years. So one of the most popular approaches to graph representation learning, beginning in the early 2000s and 2010s, is an approach called node embeddings. So here, the goal is we're trying to embed all of the nodes in our graph so that distances in this Euclidean embedding space, or often dot products within this Euclidean embedding space, approximate some notion of similarity in the original graph. And generally, the way that these node embedding functions operate is they define what are called shallow encoders. So essentially, when we're encoding a particular node into some embedding vector, we're doing this by simply doing an embedding lookup into a large matrix. So we have an embedding matrix where we have one dimensionality that's going to be equal to the number of nodes. So say we have one column per node, and then the other dimension of this matrix corresponds to the size of our embeddings. And when we want to represent a particular node, we're just going to look up this node's particular column within this embedding matrix. And using this approach, this embedding lookup approach, we can optimize low-dimensional representations for all of our nodes so that they approximate or capture some important graph structures. So for example, we can use an approach where we train these embeddings so that their dot product approximates adjacency or some higher order notion of adjacency within the original graph. Or a very popular approach is to train these embedding vectors so that their dot product is related to the probability that two nodes co-occur on a random graph, a random walk over the graph. Now, these node embedding techniques have led to many empirical successes, and they're still used to this day and achieve very impressive results in a large number of applications. However, they do have some inherent limitations. So in particular, one major issue with these traditional node embedding algorithms, things like deep walk, node to vec, is that the number of parameters that we need is linear in the size of the graph. When we're using this shallow embedding lookup idea of having a large embedding matrix, we end up needing to grow the number of parameters we're using to represent our graph linearly as more nodes are added. A related issue with these traditional node embedding algorithms is that they're inherently transductive. That means that we cannot easily generate embeddings or representations for nodes that were not seen during training. And then lastly, an issue with these traditional node embedding methods is that while they work with the structure of the graph and they learn embeddings that approximate the graph structure, they don't have a natural or elegant way of incorporating any feature information that we have associated with the graph. And in particular, we often have node level features that aren't easily incorporated within these traditional node embedding algorithms. So in order to address some of the shortcomings of these traditional node embedding approaches, there is a technique that has risen to prominence in what is generally called the graph neural network approach. So the idea with graph neural networks is that instead of just encoding nodes using an embedding lookup, we instead want to encode our nodes, generate or learn representations for our nodes that are actually a complex function of the graph structure, so the local neighborhood around that node, as well as any input features that we might have on the nodes of the graph. So to give you a visual illustration of how a standard graph neural network works, we can imagine that we're trying to generate an embedding or a representation for this target node A in this input graph. And to do this, a graph neural network is going to aggregate information from this node's local neighborhood, so here nodes B, C, and D. And then this information that's being aggregated from B, C, and D, sometimes called vector messages, is in turn going to depend on information that these nodes are aggregating from their local neighborhood, and so on. And so what I'm showing here is a two-layer graph neural network, which is aggregating information from two hop node neighborhoods in order to generate representations. And if we were to make this model deeper, we could aggregate information from further reaches in the graph. And then once we get down to the final or the first layer, so this layer that we've represented here at the right-hand side, we're going to use just the input node features to initialize the generation or learning process. So to make this a bit more formal in terms of the mathematics, the basic GNN model can be defined as follows. So first off, we're going to initialize what I'll call layer 0 embeddings is just going to be equal to our input node features, which might be given node features or even just something like the node's degree. Then, in order to define the embedding of a node at the kth layer of the graph neural network, also called the kth step of message passing, this is going to be a nonlinear function of information that we're aggregating from this node's neighborhood. So say the sum of the previous layer embeddings of this node's neighborhood, and also information coming from the previous layer representation of this node itself. And then what we're training in this graph neural network model are these linear W matrices and this bias term, which determine how exactly we aggregate and transform this information that's being taken from our local neighborhoods. So the advantages of graph neural networks compared to the traditional node embedding approaches are as follows. So first, the number of parameters that we need when we're defining a graph neural network is actually independent from the size of the graph. So when we're trying to define our graph neural network, the parameter matrices, these W matrices in this graph neural network equation, are only dependent on the initial input node feature dimensions, as well as the size of our intermediate hidden node representations. And this also means that graph neural networks are inherently inductive. So the number of parameters, the definition of a graph neural net doesn't necessarily depend on any particular graph. So we can actually apply a graph neural net to unseen graphs after training, as long as they have the same features as the graph that we trained on. And of course, another key benefit of graph neural nets is that they naturally incorporate node features. So we define graph neural nets by aggregating feature information in local neighborhoods, which means that graph neural nets can very easily and naturally work on data that has rich feature information. So in terms of generalizing and going beyond this basic graph neural net model, which I proposed in the last two slides, we can generalize this idea into what can be called the neural message passing approach, which was first described in Justin Gilmer's paper in 2017. And the idea here is that we're going to define our updated node embedding as some function of information that's aggregated from the neighbor nodes. So here we're defining this just as a generic differentiable function. And then we're also going to define some update function, which tells us how to combine the aggregated neighbor information with the node's representation from the previous layer. This is this generalized notion of aggregating from neighborhoods and then updating representations. And in terms of how we can define this generalized neighborhood aggregation, there have been many approaches proposed in the last 2 to 3 years. So for example, a natural thing that we can do is we can define a neighborhood aggregation operator using, say, self-attention. So this was proposed in the graph attention network paper. We can also aggregate using more complicated functions where we, for example, transform all the neighbor representations by a multilayer perceptron and then perform some pooling. So there are many different strategies that allow us to aggregate information from nodes and neighborhoods. In addition, in terms of the update operator, there has similarly been many proposals for how we can generalize this. So for example, rather than just summing the information coming from the neighbors as well as the node's prior representation, like in the basic GNN, we can use things such as gated recurrent units. We can also add things such as residual or skip connections. And all these different strategies can allow us to define more powerful and more flexible kinds of graph neural networks. So much or most of the work on core graph neural network methodology in the last 2 to 3 years has focused on trying to generalize these notions of aggregating and updating over node neighborhoods. But there's also a few other useful, what I'll call tricks of the trade, that I think are worth mentioning at this point. So one really important idea was this notion of what are called jumping knowledge or JK connections, which was proposed in 2018. So the idea here is that in the traditional graph neural network formulation, we run k rounds of message passing of this graph neural net equation, and then we use the final layer representations as our node embeddings. What was found in this JK paper was that we could often get much better performance if we actually define the node embeddings as a function of all of the intermediate layers of the graph neural net. So rather than just using the final layer output, we actually use the output of all the intermediate layers. Other very useful ideas that others have found have been, for example, aggregating over higher order neighborhoods within each layer of message passing. So not just looking at immediate node neighbors, but say looking at k-hop neighbors within each layer, as well as leveraging edge or graph level features in more generalized forms of message passing. Okay, so one thing you might be wondering at this point is that we've so far been focusing on this neural message passing graph neural net equation, which is telling us how to get representations of nodes. But what if we want to actually do graph level representation learning? Then we need some way to combine these node level representations into a representation for the entire graph. So there are various different ways of doing this. It's often called the pooling layer. And for example, a very simple version is just to take the sum of all of the node representations at the final layer of the GNN and use that as an embedding in the entire graph. But there are also more sophisticated proposals. So for example, hierarchical pooling approaches that actually coarsen the graph and run graph neural nets in a hierarchical manner. So for example, in our 2018 work on what's called the diff pool algorithm, we proposed an approach where we run a graph neural net on the input graph. We then cluster the nodes in this input graph together to make a coarsened version of the input graph. And we run another graph neural net on this coarsened graph, and we repeat. So in doing this, we can define a form of hierarchical pooling, which is somewhat analogous to what is done in convolutional neural networks. So that's a very quick summary of some of the key methodological innovations that have been made within graph representation learning, and in particular, in the context of graph neural networks over the past 5 or so years. So I just want to quickly comment now on some of the impact that graph neural networks have had on some important application domains. So one place where graph neural networks have had a very large impact is in computational drug design and drug repurposing. So for example, we can use graph neural networks to learn representations of molecules represented as their graph structure, and then we can use these molecule representations to, say, drive a reinforcement learning algorithm that's looking for molecules that are useful for treating certain diseases, for predicting different properties of molecules, and so on. So for example, there's a paper in 2020 by Stokes et al., the group from MIT, in Cell, which demonstrates how this graph neural network approach can actually be used to predict novel antibiotics. And in my work, we've at Mila been running an initiative called the Lambda Zero project of trying to use these ideas of representation learning on molecule structures and reinforcement learning to actually search for candidate drugs for COVID-19. And the idea here with using graph neural networks for drug repurposing is a very powerful one. It's the idea that we can try to decrease the amount of time it takes to find a new potentially useful drug by really having much more targeted discovery of potentially useful molecules. In addition to applications in computational drug and treatment design, another place where graph neural networks have had a very large impact is in recommender systems. So for example, in work in collaboration with Pinterest, we actually designed a graph neural net-based recommender system in order to predict content to users. This was actually the largest application of graph neural nets at the time, and still to this day is one of the largest applications, because we actually had to run this graph neural net on a graph containing billions of nodes. And we were able to obtain substantial gains compared to the prior art by leveraging graph neural networks. This was one example of how we applied graph neural networks at Pinterest, but I do know that graph neural networks and graph representation learning more generally is becoming increasingly popular in industry, and in particular in the context of social recommendations. So now that we've done a brief tour of the motivation, the key methodologies behind graph representation learning and graph neural networks in particular, I'm now going to turn to some of the more theoretical perspectives on GNNs. And in particular, I want to introduce 2 dominant theoretical paradigms which have been used for investigating graph neural networks. So in the first paradigm, we try to analyze graph neural networks from the perspective of signal processing, really thinking about graph neural networks as generalizing the notion of convolutions to non-Euclidean graph data. And in the second paradigm, we're going to analyze graph neural networks from the perspective of graph theory and understanding the ability of graph neural networks to distinguish isomorphic versus non-isomorphic graphs. So beginning first with this idea of understanding graph neural networks from the perspective of graph convolutions. So the intuition here is that we can think about a graph neural network as aggregating information from local node neighborhoods in a way that's analogous to a center surround filter. So that's the intuition. The theory at a high level, which I'll describe in more detail in the next few minutes, is that graph neural networks can be derived as a generalization of convolutions to the graph domain based on an idea of what's called graph Fourier analysis. So to go through the details of how we can think of graph neural networks as generalizing convolutions, we first need to give a little bit of mathematical background. So the first fact that we need is this fact that we can define what's called the Laplacian matrix, or the Laplacian operator for a graph. So how we define this, and in particular, I'm going to define what's called the symmetric normalized Laplacian. It's going to be defined as the identity matrix subtract the symmetric normalized adjacency matrix, which is essentially the adjacency matrix for the graph, which we've normalized according to the different node degrees. And the interpretation of this Laplacian matrix is that it allows us to measure the difference between a signal at a node and that node's neighbors. So in particular, if we think about a signal on a graph, where a signal is essentially some real value at each of the nodes on the graph, multiplying the signal by the Laplace operator allows us to measure the difference between that signal at each node and its neighbors. Now, the second key fact that we need is the fact that the graph Laplacian, as I've defined it, is really a discretized, or the graph domain analog of the more general Laplace operator on Euclidean space. So in particular, the general Laplace operator on Euclidean space is measuring the divergence of the gradient of a function. And the intuition here is that both of these operators are measuring how much a signal or how much a function value differs between a point and that point's immediate neighborhood. Now, the third key fact that we need to understand the relationship between graph neural networks and graph convolutions is the fact that the generalized eigenfunctions of the Laplace operator on Euclidean space are the Fourier modes. So to unpack this, the key idea here is that the eigenfunctions, so the generalization of the eigenvectors of the Laplace operator, they correspond to the different plane waves in Euclidean space. So really, when we apply the Laplace operator to a wave function, to the plane wave function, what we get back is the same wave function multiplied by a constant. And the key thing to note from this, the key thing to take away, is that Fourier analysis, so doing, say, the Fourier decomposition in Euclidean space, essentially involves representing or projecting an input signal onto the eigenbasis of the Laplace operator. And so what we can do if we want to do graph Fourier analysis is we can just define the analog of this. So if Fourier transform in Euclidean space involves representing things in the eigenbasis of the Euclidean Laplace operator, well then we can do Fourier analysis in the graph space by representing an input signal on the eigenbasis, or the eigenvectors, of the graph Laplacian. So in particular, we can define the graph Fourier transform of a signal on the graph by multiplying by the inverse, or the transpose, of the Laplacian eigenvectors. And then we can analogously define the inverse graph Fourier transform by just multiplying by the inverse of those vectors. So a graph convolution can now be defined because we have the graph Fourier decomposition. So in particular, if we want to convolve an input signal x by some filter f, all we need to do is we need to take the graph Fourier transform of both of those signals, and then we do element-wise multiplication within this Fourier space, because this is the definition of a convolutional filter, and then we do the inverse graph Fourier transform to get back into the original graph domain. So the key interpretation, the key ideas here are, first off, that the eigenvectors of a graph Laplacian, they're really the analog of the Fourier basis. They're really the analog of different sinusoidal plane waves. And similarly, the Laplacian eigenvalues, they're playing the roles of frequencies within the graph domain. So what does this all have to do with graph neural networks? Well, a key thing to note is that in practice, we can define convolutions in this graph domain by taking polynomials of the normalized adjacency matrix. So in particular, the normalized adjacency matrix can be simultaneously diagonalized with the graph Laplacian. And this means that the normalized adjacency matrix, if we take a polynomial of it and we multiply that polynomial by some input signal on the graph, this is equivalent to taking the graph Fourier transform of that signal, multiplying that signal by some diagonal matrix, which is an element-wise multiplication, and then taking the inverse graph Fourier transform. So the key idea here is that when we're taking the polynomial, any polynomial of the adjacency matrix that's been appropriately normalized, and we multiply some signal by that polynomial, that is equivalent to some convolution in the graph Fourier domain. And the key insight here is that multiplying by a polynomial of the adjacency matrix gives a valid graph convolution. And we know that multiplying by the adjacency matrix is really the core operation that's going on in graph neural network message passing. So in particular, the neighborhood aggregation that we perform in graph neural network message passing is equivalent to multiplying by the adjacency matrix. And similarly, if we aggregate higher order neighborhood information, that's equivalent to multiplying by a higher power of the adjacency matrix. So really, in this view, we can think of many, but not all graph neural networks, essentially as involving simple graph convolutional filters, so aggregations over neighborhoods by multiplying by polynomials of the adjacency matrix, and then applying some linear projections or nonlinear functions on top of these simple convolutions. So that's a quick summary of how we can view graph neural networks as being a generalization or being inspired by the notion of convolutions on graphs. However, this is not the only theoretical perspective that has been used to analyze graph neural networks. And in particular, the other theoretical perspective that has been used for analyzing graph neural networks is understanding graph neural networks from the perspective of graph isomorphism testing. So the key high-level idea here is that graph neural networks can be viewed as a continuous and differentiable version of a classic graph isomorphism algorithm, which is called the WL test. So to first give you the idea of what this graph isomorphism testing algorithm is, the WL test is an approach that's been around for many years, over 50 years in graph theory, and it allows us to generate a representation of a graph that we can use to test whether or not one graph is isomorphic to another. So the basic idea behind the WL algorithm is as follows. So what we're going to do is we're first going to initialize our input graph with some colors on all of our nodes. So here I've colored this input graph where each node is colored according to its degree. Next, we do rounds of what are called color refinement, which you can think of as a form of message passing. The idea here is that as we're iterating, every node is going to now get a new label, a new feature vector, which tells it the set of colors and the multi-set of colors within its local neighborhood. And we can iterate this process over and over multiple rounds. And the key idea is that when we're iterating this WL algorithm, every node is looking at the set of colors or labels within its local neighborhood, aggregating all those labels together, and using that aggregated set of labels, that multi-set, to define a new label, and so on. And really, graph neural nets are essentially a continuous and differentiable version of this WL algorithm. So in particular, in the WL algorithm, we initialize each node with a discrete label, In the GNN message passing algorithm, we initialize each node with a continuous embedding. In the WL algorithm, for each node during the message passing or the color refinement, we get a new label for a node by hashing the multi-set of labels within that node's local neighborhood. In the graph neural network setting, for each node, we get a new embedding for that node by applying some neural network function to the set of embeddings within that node's local neighborhood. And indeed, this analogy between graph neural networks and this classic WL algorithm, which this WL algorithm in practice is used to generate histograms or feature vectors for graphs that can be used to test for isomorphism. This analogy between graph neural nets and this WL test is actually more than just intuitive. Indeed, it can be proved. So for example, in our work in AAAI 2019, that any basic graph neural network architecture, so for example, the architecture I'm showing here, is at least as powerful as the WL algorithm. So in particular, there exists a parameter setting for this basic graph neural network such that any two graphs that can be distinguished by the WL algorithm can also be distinguished by the GNN. And similarly, we can look at this in the other direction. So in particular, any graph neural network architecture that has this aggregate and update form is no more powerful than the WL test. So any basic message passing graph neural network, if there's a pair of graphs where the WL test fails to distinguish them, our graph neural network will also fail on this pair of graphs. Now, after this work on the relationship between graph neural networks and the WL test, there's a lot of interest in trying to generalize graph neural networks and understand this relationship further. And so an important thing to note here is that this WL test, this Weisfeiler-Lehman isomorphism testing algorithm, can actually be generalized into what's called the hierarchy of KWL tests, where the idea here is that instead of doing this coloring or message passing between nodes, we can actually do it between subgraphs. And these KWL algorithms give a nice hierarchy where the KWL algorithm is always more powerful than the K-1 W algorithm, and so on. So there have been proposals to create graph neural nets that are as powerful as these KWL algorithms. So for example, the invariant and equivariant K-order GNNs by Maron et al. However, most of these algorithms, or at least the algorithms we have now, are quite computationally intensive, and they've yet to really witness sustained empirical success and adoption. Okay, so that summarizes our brief tour of the key theoretical perspectives on graph neural nets. And now, in the final few minutes, I just want to talk about how these theoretical perspectives give rise to some important open challenges within graph representation learning. So first off, in terms of the relationship between the graph neural networks and this WL isomorphism test, or the WL hierarchy, in my view, one of the really important open challenges is thinking about how we can build graph neural network models that really go beyond the WL hierarchy. So some important questions here are there other paradigms that we can use to characterize the power of GNNs in a constructive way? For example, perhaps we should be focusing on different kinds of graph invariants. And also related to this is this question of how prevalent are KWL indistinguishable graphs in the real world? How important is it that we can be as powerful as the 4WL test? Are there other views of graph theory and graph isomorphism that are going to be more constructive for the development and design of new kinds of graph neural networks? Now, from the perspective of graph signal processing, there's a related and very interesting open challenge. So here, there's this issue that we've observed with respect to standard graph neural network models. And this is this issue of what's called oversmoothing. So the issue here is that if you make really deep graph neural network models that have many layers, often you end up with all the node embeddings looking the same. So your node representations become oversmoothed. And the theoretical explanation for this is that when we run a really deep graph neural network, it becomes similar to a high order polynomial of the adjacency matrix, which tends to magnify the influence of the dominant eigenvalues of this adjacency matrix, which ends up corresponding to relatively uninteresting low-pass filters in the graph Fourier domain. So some really important open problems in this space include trying to understand how we can design more complex and deep graph convolutions that can leverage more high frequency signals in a meaningful way without just converging to these simple low pass filters. Another important question is this question of how we can define analogs of things like bandpass filters and texture filters, these more interesting forms of filters within the graph domain. Now, a third open challenge is a challenge that's more related to the computational structure of graph neural networks. So when we think about the computational structure, the computation graph behind a graph neural net, as I've shown here, it always becomes a form of tree structure. When we're representing the embedding of a node A, this representation is going to depend on a tree structured computation graph that's emerging from this node based on this message passing algorithm. Now, one issue with this tree structured computation graph is it inherently leads to a lot of computational bottlenecks. We're essentially trying to compress an exponentially growing tree into a smaller and smaller amount of representational capacity. And so some important questions here include trying to understand whether or not there are more effective forms of computational paradigms, skip connections, other kinds of techniques that can help us avoid the negative implications of this computational bottleneck. And there's also the question of trying to understand whether or not there are more effective and theoretically grounded ways of propagating information between nodes in the graph that avoids this tree-structured bottleneck. And finally, what I want to close on is just to remark that these three different challenges I've mentioned, this idea of trying to go beyond the WL hierarchy, which is induced by this aggregate and update message passing paradigm, this idea of trying to go beyond low pass filters or polynomials of the adjacency matrix, and this challenge of tree structured computation graphs, these are not necessarily three different problems. In fact, I suspect that these are really different instantiations of the same underlying issue. And I think pushing the limit of what we can do in graph representation learning is going to take not just solving these open challenges, but also understanding the relationship between these various different theoretical perspectives and understanding how we can map between analysis that we're doing in this graph Fourier analysis and understanding the implications of that analysis from the perspective of graph theory and isomorphism testing. So with that, I just want to thank all of my students who've been involved in many parts of this work, and also everyone who's made this research possible through funding that they've provided. Thanks.